Hello and welcome to the Arise interview. 60 minutes of big questions about the big stories from the news and beyond with fresh insight and critical analysis. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Coming up in the next hour, on his first ever trip to Africa after nearly 2 years in office, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been on a tour of some sub-Saharan African countries. His first stop was Senegal, then Angola a day later, and now the visit is ending in Ethiopia. But is Mr. Pompeo's trip to the continent more about China than Africa? We'll discuss President Trump's unimpressive engagement with the continent, something that has disappointed many. And later, if you were holding your breath waiting for the Nigerian Supreme Court's decision on the application to review its judgment that sacked Emeka Ihedioha as governor of Imo State, a political earthquake decision that shattered the Richter scale, well, you can breathe easy now, at least until March the 2nd. That's the earliest date that the parties can now expect a decision, which of course may or may not usher in a new political reality in Imo State. We'll assess moves by both sides to win over the Supreme Court and take control of the state in a moment. Now, as you probably know, Donald Trump has never visited Africa as president. The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, though, has been on the continent for the past 3 days. Mr. Pompeo is the first American cabinet official to set foot in Africa in 18 months. His visit comes as the US military is considering reducing its presence in West Africa's Sahel region, where extremists linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State group are expanding their reach, killing hundreds of civilians. But none of those countries was on Mr. Pompeo's list for a stopover. Instead, he's been visiting Senegal, Angola, and Ethiopia.
This is the beginning of my first trip to sub-Saharan Africa as Secretary of State. There was no better place to start than right here in Senegal, a vibrant democracy, rich in culture and history. The United States is proud to count Senegal as one of our closest friends on the continent. And one of the surest signs of our friendship, too, is the fact that our private companies flock here to Senegal. During our meeting, I congratulated both the President and the Foreign Minister on the newly discovered energy reserves off the coast. American firms like Cosmos Energy, Halliburton, Baker Hughes are all helping to develop these resources so that they benefit the Senegalese people, not foreign actors. Senegal's leaders and I also talked about Islamist terrorism, which endangers 350 million people right here in West Africa. It threatens Americans too, and we are counting on Senegal. It is an important ally in this fight, and I assured our friends that the U.S. will keep up this fight as well. In addition, we discussed how the United States can continue training and supporting Senegalese peacekeepers in the region. Their success, helping transition the Gambia to a democracy, is a historic legacy. I don't think that particular instance changes the analysis of what's going on with the coronavirus around the world, but I think we all need to be mindful of the serious nature of the threat that is posed, especially in places that don't have significant healthcare infrastructure. I was talking with our ambassador today. We have CDC official here in Senegal. We have CDC officials in the United States in many countries around the world, and we're prepared to do everything that the United States can do to reduce the risk to populations, especially those populations where there is not significant, capable healthcare infrastructure. That presents a lot of risk, and we are already doing our best.
Well, for more on Mike Pompeo's sub-Saharan Africa visit, I'm joined now in the studio by the international journalist and Arise News analyst Donu Kabara, and by the diplomat representing the Caribbean twin nations of Antigua and Barbuda here in Nigeria, Ambassador Wallace Williams. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. And let me start with you, Donu. What do you think interests the United States in this cluster of 3 countries? Because, I mean, they're all very different countries, and it's not entirely clear what sort of history of engagement the US has with all 3.
Well, I should imagine that America regards all of them as potential countries that are going somewhere. Senegal has a long history of being pretty stable by African standards.
Politically stable.
Yes.
Right.
Angola, as we all know, is a sort of huge economic powerhouse, potentially. In fact, so much so that it actually bailed Portugal out recently of an economic logjam. And it's heading in the right direction in terms of anti-corruption measures. Now that Eduardo dos Santos and his family have left, and Isabella, his daughter, the richest woman in Africa, is being confronted about her corrupt practices. And then as far as Ethiopia goes, I mean, Abiy Ahmed is probably the most impressive leader on the continent at the moment. He's got a lot to offer. He's a Nobel Prize winning head of state. And
he's a good person to rub shoulders.
Yeah.
If you want to sort of promote good governance in Africa.
That's right. He's a perfect partner.
Right. Let me bring in Ambassador Wallace Williams in. Just following up on what Donu was saying. In Senegal, for instance, the US sees a long-time partner on a number of security issues, development, health, that sort of thing, a beacon of democratic stability on the continent. Angola, economic relationship, but a more prickly political relationship. And Washington sees an opportunity with the new Lorenzo, the new sort of president there, deepening engagement in that part of the world.
I think you should try and triangulate what they're doing. If you look at it, mainly it's strategic as well. Not forgetting that recently China decided to go on the other side of the East Coast, right? And that is to put a base there, right? So if I'm looking at it, I would look at it strictly, in this case, from a military point of view. Southern Africa, Angola, largest oil reserves and energy and gas. Let's work with them. Senegal, on that side of
on the West African coast.
On the West African coast, let's work with them. Strategically, if you look at the nearest point to America is Senegal, not anywhere else, right? And then if you look at Ethiopia, yes, Ethiopia is going places, and of course it's one of the areas, as you mentioned, China has had a major influence in. So if they have to start a fight back, to gain territory, both from an economic point of view and a political and strategic point of view, they're triangulating. They're ensuring, well, let's choose, forget West Africa for the time being. Let's look at South Africa, where we have large, huge resources in Angola. Let's look at Ethiopia, where the Chinese have really, embedded themselves. And Senegal, which is our nearest African neighbor. And let's make sure that if we need to put a base there, let's have a base there. Let's basically.
Well, let me ask you this. I'll come to you in a minute, Donu. But wearing your military hat, and just to remind people that you were a military officer, there is, of course, the warning that the violence that has affected the Sahel region could spread to West African littoral states on the coast, like Senegal. Is Mr. Pompeo,
aware of that?
Yeah, is he hearing appeals there for the U.S. military not to pull out of the region? Because that's a big issue now.
Well, that is going to be something that has to really be taken on board. If you are saying, let's say, you are going to have any base in Senegal, for example, is there a reason for pulling out at this point in time? If you're going to use them as part of your proxy, you need to stay there and show the world, the democratic world, that you are on the side of democracy and that you're fighting, any, insurgency that is going to spread and affect the rest of the...
And of course you claim to be fighting terrorism, and you've got Al-Qaeda and Islamic State operating in the Sahel.
So you need to show, by not doing what was recently done, where people have complained that they pulled out Syria, and the Turks just moved in, right? Let's not have a repeat of that. If you are the policeman of the world, right?
But Trump is making clear that he's no longer the policeman of the world.
America for economic reasons, they have to continue.
Right.
To
But let me bring Donu in, because that's a very interesting point the ambassador is making. Mixed messages coming from the US government. And of course, at the other side of the continent, you talked about Ethiopia, the United States seeing itself as some sort of competition with China, because if you talk about a country where China is manifesting itself, it's got to be Ethiopia, and it would make, it wouldn't make strategic sense, just following up on what the ambassador is saying, for America to be pulling out its troops out of Africa and leaving the place open for the likes of Russia and China to sort of move in and take its place, and then at the same time be talking about having strategic competition with China on the continent.
And your question is?
Well,
I agree with you?
It's a discussion.
Yes. It's a big one. Yeah, I totally agree with everything the ambassador said. And I think that we are looking at a proxy war, a trade war, if you like. The chessboard is there, and everybody's making their moves. But I do wonder about the sort of almost exclusive choice of those three countries. I assume that at some point Pompeo will come back, or Trump might actually set foot in a continent he doesn't appear to have a very high regard for, because Senegal, Ethiopia, and Angola won't cut it. They have to engage with Nigeria. They have to engage with Egypt. They have to engage with South Africa, for example.
So what do you say is at the heart of the Trump administration's Africa strategy, if there is any such thing? Is there an Africa strategy?
Well, perhaps they're groping in the dark. The State Department is an independent entity, almost, that will have its own foreign policy wonks and mandarins, and they will have a clear idea of where they want to go. The joy of a civilized democracy, I suppose, is that no one person has that kind of pull.
Right.
So President Trump's view of Africa is not going to completely overtake American foreign policy.
Right, okay, well, we've got less than a minute before we take a break, Ambassador. Is it this idea of major power competition, a throwback to that framework where Africa is seen as a place to engage in a push and pull for influence?
Well, I think there is some truth to that, right? There is, at the moment, the fact that the continent has a lot of resources, and they have missed out, right? Because when they were trying to engage the African continent, they put so many barriers.
Okay, straight away to you, Ambassador, because you were talking about this Chinese influence.
Yeah.
What I needed to ask you was, what do you really reckon the Americans are after in Africa? Is it influence that they're after, or are they after the commodities, oil, diamonds?
Well, I think a bit of all.
Right.
A bit of all. I think obviously they missed the boat, or at least they've thought they've missed the boat in terms of the commodities, especially oil, energy, gas.
But they don't really need oil. America
no longer
imports oil from
has
Africa.
Political and economic influence. Whoever owns it or whoever has it, you can play the international game with it.
Well, but America has it.
Yeah, they
America
have it.
has the biggest reserves in the world.
Yeah, they're
today.
fracking it. But nonetheless, you still have a lot of influence in terms of what the resources of the African continent has. And if you need to influence, the way that Africa is going to go, you've got to now compete with the Chinese and others. France have already got their departments, right? And of course, the British after Brexit will come back to, their old colonial countries to trade. And so you find that these are converging at the moment. America is saying, where are we?
But looking at the Caribbean, where you're from, I was in the Caribbean at the same time that you were there at one point. I spoke to the Prime Minister.
Yes, I took you there.
You took me to the Prime Minister, and of Antigua and Barbuda. And one of the big issues there was the incredible presence of China in that region. I can imagine that makes the Americans uncomfortable. It's their backyard.
Of course, absolutely correct. Because, for example, in Antigua, they've decided that they would build a port. Antigua being, one of the cruise ships hub now and more influence. Why didn't America say, let's come there and help you develop your deep port. When there was a hurricane there 2 years ago and help was needed, you know, this is your neighbor. But instead, you know, if you're getting help, anywhere it comes from, to help
Yeah, well,
rebuild,
absolutely. If
to
you
help
need help,
rebuild your economy
absolutely.
and to help rebuild your country, it's whoever comes forward. And it is okay to say, yes, it's corrupt money, etc., but money is money if you're going to get it to help. At the end of the day, who distributes it and how they utilize it, that's another question. But who's making the offer? Who's coming and say, hey, you know, we need to help you because you know your little
And who's not waving a big stick whilst making
doing
that
it
offer
at the same time?
Yeah, which is another story altogether.
Exactly.
Well, let me bring Donu in. Is the calculus in America shifting towards trying to keep China, even if it's of no strategic, I mean, Africa is of no strategic, because I mean, Donald Trump hasn't really expressed that much interest in Africa. If it doesn't need the commodities, if it doesn't need, you know, strategically need Africa from a security point of view, although the feeling seems to be that it does, I mean, would it be enough for America to simply try to shift China away from those commodities, even if the US itself is not interested in them? That becomes the strategic end in itself. You see what I mean?
Well, I suppose a lot of these things are to do with national pride. They have been engaged in a trade war with China. They do seem to regard China as their main rival. And so, yeah, it's that dog in the manger thing, perhaps, where even in areas such as oil reserves, that hydrocarbon reserves, where you don't really need them, you also don't want your main rival getting their hands on them. And I think it's very interesting the way Pompeo is conveying this very sort of like open competitiveness. I mean, in Angola, for example, in Luanda, he said, when he was doing a press conference with the foreign minister, I think Manuel Augusto, that we will hire Angolans. He was talking about the pros and cons, and he said, well, we'll leave it up to onlookers to decide who the better foreign
of
power
course,
is.
The impression is the Chinese bring their own lot in.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so he said, you know, I'll leave it up to you to decide, but by the way, we hire locals. And that is actually something I think that all African countries...
It's a direct challenge to what China
Well, I mean,
is
just picking up from
I think
that...
all African countries should take that
Sure,
very
picking up from
seriously.
that, Ambassador, I mean, what could the United States actually offer Africa?
Well, if they say they've got a growth fund and a growth plan, come in to the African continent and help the African continent grow. You know, employ Africans who have the skills, bring the funds in, and if you say it's all transparent, yes, do the direct investment, and do the two things you said you can do. Bring in the funds and employ Africans. That will make a difference, and that will be a paradigm shift away from what your rivals are doing, which is bringing in the funds, but also bringing in their own employees, you know, and doing the major projects. And as a matter of fact, if you look at it, it's a little bit more strategic too. I mean, if you look at the infrastructure and the type of projects that the Chinese are doing, is that they're looking at putting infrastructure in place to take out a lot of the resources. If anybody do an overplan on the whole African continent, where they're putting the trains, where the deep water ports are, etc., it's part of that, what do they call that, belt?
Yes.
And
I mean, would it make a difference if the American president, Donald Trump,
absolutely
embarked on a trip across Africa, for example?
Africa,
I mean, and being the one to deliver that top line message.
Absolutely. Across the continent, hit east, west, central, south.
And basically say that the US presents an important alternative to China.
No, not even an important alternative. Just say, we are your partners.
Yeah.
You know, it's not about alternatives now, because it's about partnership now. Alternatives mean to say that, all right, I'm going to give you something for what they are giving you, I'm going to give you something different. No, it's not different. It's partnering, because the same thing, it's about funding, and it's more about employment.
But given that we're not seeing any moves on the part of Trump, I mean, you know, this is now his 4th year. There's been no discussion at all. I mean, this is the first time since Mike Pompeo became Secretary of State that he's actually ventured this way. I mean, what does that tell us, that the great deal maker is really not interested in making deals with Africa?
Well, I think he's very afraid of China. He would probably rather not bother with Africa. This is my own personal opinion. But you can't ignore certain things. I mean, even the coronavirus scare, which has so undermined China, has also highlighted China's tremendous capacity. I mean, how long did it take them to build a hospital? 10 days?
Well, how many, not just a hospital, but the number of beds. Was it 2,000 or
Scary.
4,000? Scary.
I would imagine it makes America extremely nervous.
Absolutely. But I think if we are to discuss their strategy, if you look at it, and he mentioned and he highlighted all the things they're doing in the energy sector. He's promoting the energy companies, Halliburton, Cosmos, these are the things. So really he is probably there waving a flag, like the Queen of England does sometimes for some of the companies in the United Kingdom. I'm waving the flag for these companies, employ them. Because if you drill right down, I am promoting Baker Hughes, Halliburton, Cosmos. I mean, that's the message I got.
Well, I mean, that is always the message. That's always the top line message.
Yes.
I mean, but the underlying message is always the strategic interests of America in Africa.
May I say that I think it's also very important for Africans to have a very, very serious discussion about this issue of China versus the West, America, but also Europe. Because I think the point that Pompeo made, perhaps I'm too Eurocentric or West-centric, but the point he made about employment to me is absolutely critical. I've never been particularly enamored of China's huge push into Africa, but I know people who are. And I think Africans also, we're not passive recipients of American ambitions or European ambitions. We've got to decide ourselves.
Well, besides, there's nothing wrong with having a wide variety of partners.
Yes.
I mean, we shouldn't be this or that. It could be either of them.
However, what you should do...
Very briefly, we're out of time.
However, what you should do is you should dictate what that partnership should be.